Bridget stood up in the middle of the most important boardroom meeting of the year, looked Hanel dead in the eyes, and stopped translating his words. She started translating the truth instead. 22 executives from 4 countries were in that room. 2 acquisition deals worth a combined $300 million sat on the table. Hanel had been speaking in Korean for the last 4 minutes, smooth, controlled, the polished cadence of a man who had given this kind of performance 100 times. And for the last 4 minutes, Bridget had been delivering a very different speech to the English-speaking partners on the other side of the table. Not a mistranslation, not an error. A perfect, word-for-word account of exactly what Hanel had actually said, including the parts he had been saying for 6 months, in Korean, inside this company, in rooms full of people he believed could not understand him. The Nigerian partner seated across from Hanel, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Mrs. Ademi, who ran one of the largest port logistics companies on the continent, slowly set down her pen. She looked at Bridget. She looked at Hanel. She looked back at Bridget. The room went so quiet that the air conditioning sounded like a storm. Hanel's face did not break. He was too trained for that, but his jaw shifted. A micro-movement, barely visible, the kind that only someone who had been watching him very carefully for a very long time would catch. Bridget had been watching him carefully for 6 months. She caught it. Now let me tell you how a woman gets to a moment like that, because it doesn't happen by accident. It happens by endurance, by strategy, and by the specific kind of patience that only comes when the anger runs deep enough to be cold. Bridget spoke 5 languages: English, French, Yoruba, Mandarin, and Korean. The last one learned over 4 years of deliberate, obsessive study because she had seen, early in her career, that Korean business was expanding aggressively across West Africa, and that the interpreters who could bridge that specific gap were rare, expensive, and in permanent demand. She was 29. She had spent 3 years doing simultaneous interpretation for international trade conferences. She was fast, precise, and had a memory for linguistic nuance that her colleagues genuinely could not explain. She didn't just translate words, she translated intent. Subtext. The thing underneath the thing that was being said. It was, as it turned out, a skill that would matter more than she ever imagined. When Yon Global, a Korean investment firm with new offices across Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra, offered her a senior interpreter role, she took it without hesitation. The salary was serious. The work was exactly what she was built for. She moved to Lagos and reported for her first day with the particular confidence of someone who knows they are exactly right for a job. CEO arrived late to the orientation meeting. Kang Hanel, 34 years old, the kind of handsome that the wrong kind of man always seems to be, symmetrical in a way that looked like the universe had made an error in judgment. He shook the hands of every Korean executive in the room. He did not look at the African staff. He sat down and said in fast, casual Korean, the Korean of a man absolutely certain no one around him could understand, which one is the translator they hired. I hope she's better than the last one. The last one had the English of a secondary school student. Bridget was sitting 3 seats to his left. She smiled at nothing, wrote a note in her folder, and said nothing. That was the first lie he told about her, in a room full of people, out loud, with complete confidence. It would not be the last. Within 2 weeks, Bridget understood exactly what Hanel was doing, and exactly why. It wasn't random cruelty. It was a system. Hanel used his Korean fluency the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, deliberately, to cut things that needed cutting without leaving visible marks. In meetings with African partners, he would speak Korean to his deputy, and Bridget would translate. What the partners didn't know was that Hanel sometimes used those Korean language asides to quietly redirect deals, undercut positions, or share private assessments of the people sitting across the table from him. Assessments that were never meant to reach the ears of the people being assessed. and Bridget was supposed to be his instrument for keeping that separation clean, because she was not supposed to understand the Korean. Hanel had read her hearing file. It listed her languages as English, French, and Yoruba. Korean was not on it because Bridget had not put it on there. She had learned in her first international role that the moment employers discovered the full range of what you could do, they found ways to use it against you. So she kept her Korean off paper, off her CV, off every official record associated with her professional life. She had not planned to weaponize that decision. Not at first. She had simply been careful. But then the sabotage started. The first incident was a contract negotiation with a Ghanaian development firm. Bridget had worked with the lead negotiator for 2 days, built rapport, laid the groundwork for a clean agreement. Then in the room, Hanel said in Korean to his deputy right in front of her, right in front of the Ghanaian team, "Tell finance to move the revised terms through before they review the original. By the time they notice the clause change, it'll be signed." Bridget translated the sentence that came before it and the sentence that came after it. She said nothing about the middle. She went home that night and wrote it down. Date, time, exact words, who was present. She started a document. That document would eventually run to 41 pages. The things Hanel said about Bridget in Korean in her presence to his colleagues, built up over 6 months, the way sediment builds up at the bottom of something that looks clean from the surface. He told his deputy she was decorative but replaceable. He told a visiting executive from Seoul that African staff needed more supervision because their concept of urgency was different, and looked directly at Bridget when he said it. He told his operations manager that Bridget's contract should be reviewed at the 3-month mark because women like that get comfortable and start having opinions. Bridget translated around every one of these. She did not flinch. She did not let her eyes change. She had learned in the hard years of her early career how to hold things in her face that her body was screaming. But she wrote everything down, and she started making different decisions. When Hanel asked her to prepare briefing documents for the Nigerian and Kenyan partner meetings, she prepared them and quietly included one additional paragraph in the version sent to the African partners, a paragraph that summarized, in plain English, the general negotiating strategy Yon Global typically employed and the specific clauses that tended to shift between drafts. She didn't call it anything. She just made the partners smarter. She started attending the pre-meeting briefings that were held in Korean, briefings she was technically not invited to, but which happened in a glass-walled conference room she walked past every morning. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. She listened from the corridor and wrote the relevant parts down. And then came the day that changed the shape of everything. It was a Thursday, 4 months into her contract. Hanel's office door was 3/4 closed. Bridget was walking past with a folder of documents for the finance team. She was not eavesdropping. She was just fluent. Hanel was on a call with someone in Seoul. His voice had the slightly different register it always took when he was speaking to someone he actually respected. He was talking about the Lagos expansion, about the 3 major acquisition targets, about the timeline. And then he said the name of the firm he intended to destroy. Not acquire, destroy. Adami Logistics, Mrs. Adami's company. The silver-haired woman Bridget had spent 4 months watching Hanel court with enormous care, was not a genuine acquisition target. It was a strategic elimination. Hanel's plan was to bring Adami Logistics into an exclusive partnership agreement, lock their port contracts inside a Yon Global subsidiary structure, allow the partnership to collapse under engineered financial pressure 18 months later, and absorb the contracts and client relationships in the restructuring. Mrs. Adami would walk away with a settlement. Her company would effectively cease to exist. And Yon Global would control the largest private port logistics network in West Africa, without ever appearing to have dismantled a competitor. Bridget stood in the corridor for 10 seconds after the call ended. She counted them. Then she walked to the finance office, delivered the folder, said good morning to the team, and went to her desk. She opened her document. She typed for 22 minutes without stopping. And then she picked up her phone and sent a very careful, very brief email to an address she had been holding for 3 months, the personal assistant of Mrs. Adami, asking for a private meeting at a time and location of Mrs. Adami's choosing. The reply came in 4 hours. The meeting was set for the following Saturday, a private club in Victoria Island in a room with no windows. Bridget brought the document, printed, tabbed, cross-referenced. 41 pages of dates, translated transcripts, incident records, and a 14-page legal analysis she had paid for out of her own pocket from a commercial law firm in Lekki that specialized in corporate fraud. Mrs. Adami read for 40 minutes without speaking. Bridget sat across from her and drank water and waited. When Mrs. Adami finished, she set the document down, looked at Bridget, and said, "What do you want?" Bridget had prepared for this question. She had turned it over for weeks, checking it from every angle, testing whether her answer was clean, whether it was about justice, or about something smaller and more personal that she needed to be honest with herself about. She wanted both, and she was at peace with that. What she told Mrs. Adami was this: she did not want money. She did not want a job. She wanted the Adami Logistics Partnership meeting, the big one, the one scheduled in 6 weeks at Yon Global's Lagos headquarters, the one that was supposed to produce a signed exclusivity agreement, to be the last meeting Hannel ever ran without knowing who was really in the room. Mrs. Adami studied her for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me what you need me to do." The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest of Bridget's professional life, not because of the pressure, but because of the performance required to maintain them. She had to keep going to work every morning. She had to keep translating for Hannel, keep navigating his small and large humiliations, keep holding her face in exactly the right position while he said things in Korean that landed on her like stones, and she filed each one away without expression. He said she was starting to look complacent. He told his deputy that he was going to recommend her contract not be renewed because she lacks initiative. He used the Korean word that translated most accurately as furniture, present, functional, not worth addressing directly, to describe her role in a meeting with 3 sole executives who had flown in for a governance review. Bridget wrote it all down. She was no longer writing out of survival instinct. She was writing because every entry was another piece of what was coming. Meanwhile, Mrs. Adami was preparing her side of the meeting. She had brought in 2 things Hannel did not know about: a Korean-speaking legal counsel from a Seoul-based firm that had no connection to Yon Global, and a retired Korean regulatory official who now consulted for the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission. A man whose name, when spoken in certain Korean business circles, produced a very specific silence. They would all be in the room, presented as part of the Adami Logistics delegation, introduced in English. Hannel would not know any of them understood Korean until the moment Bridget decided he should. The Yon Global boardroom on the day of the Adami partnership signing was the most expensive room Bridget had ever stood in. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a table that seated 24 water carafes from a brand Bridget had never heard of until she Googled one out of morbid curiosity. 22 people in total, the full Yon Global Lagos executive team on one side, the Adami Logistics delegation on the other. Bridget stood at the front of the room beside the presentation screen, in the position she always occupied, visible, functional, and to Hannel's understanding, entirely without interior life. Hannel opened the meeting in English, warm, polished, the specific warmth of a man performing genuine feeling with the precision of someone who had practiced it. He spoke about partnership and shared vision and the future of logistics infrastructure in West Africa. He was excellent at this. Bridget had watched him be excellent at this for 6 months and had never once confused the performance for the person. Then the presentation moved to the contract terms. Hanel's deputy began walking through the structure. Hanel leaned toward his chief legal officer and said, in Korean, quiet, conversational, the way you speak to someone at a dinner table, the exclusivity clause is on page 9. Make sure a dame's counsel doesn't get to review it before they're in signing position. The English version has some softened language that the Korean internal version doesn't. Keep them on the summary deck. Bridget looked up from her notes. She looked at Mrs. Adami. Mrs. Adami held her gaze for exactly 1 second. That was the signal they had agreed on. Bridget set down her pen. She straightened, and she began to speak in English clearly to the entire room, translating what Hanel had just said, word for word, including the part about the softened language, including the part about keeping them away from the full document. The room stopped breathing. Hanel turned to look at her. For the first time in 6 months, he looked at her, really looked, the way you look at something that has just moved in a way you did not authorize. Bridget held his gaze. She did not look away. She had not come this far to look away. Mrs. Adami spoke. She said, in a voice that had not needed to be raised in 30 years of business because it had never needed volume to carry authority, that she would like to pause the meeting. She introduced the Korean-speaking legal counsel, who now addressed the room in fluent Korean, confirming that he had been present and had understood everything said in Korean during the meeting so far. She introduced the retired regulatory official, who nodded once at Hanel with the particular expression of a man who has seen this specific type of situation many times and has never once been surprised by how it ends. Hanel's chief legal officer put his pen down. One of the sole executives opened his mouth, closed it, opened a folder, put it back down. Hanel said nothing. He was doing the calculation, the rapid, desperate arithmetic of a man realizing how much of the last 6 months had been witnessed, recorded, and understood by the woman he had used as furniture. The answer was all of it. The meeting ended without a signature. The Adami legal team left with copies of the full Korean language contract, the internal strategy memos Bridget had documented, and a formal notice of intent to file a complaint with the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission. Hanel sat in the boardroom after everyone left. Bridget was still there. She was the last to leave, as always, because her job technically included clearing the interpretation equipment from the room. She moved through it quietly, unplugging cables, folding cords, doing the mundane physical work of a role that had just detonated 6 months of careful construction. Hanel said her name. Not the translator, not a gesture in her direction to his deputy, her name, Bridget. She paused, looked at him. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, a man stripped of the instrument he had used, the assumption that had made him feel safe, the specific blindness that power produces in people who are never made to see clearly. He looked, for the first time, like what he actually was, a very talented person who had built a very sophisticated operation on the foundation of other people's invisibility, and who had just discovered that invisibility is not a quality that belongs to the person. It belongs to the permission they choose to grant. Bridget had stopped granting it. He asked her how long she had understood Korean. She said, since before I could understand why it mattered that some people didn't know. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you could have reported me at any point. She looked at him with the patience of someone who has had this conversation in their head many more times than the other person knows. I could have, but a report gets buried. What happened today doesn't. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. She was right and they both knew it. What happened next surprised her, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. He didn't threaten. He didn't reach for the usual levers of powerful men who have been exposed. He sat in the boardroom of his own company, in a city he had come to extract from, and he was quiet in the way people are quiet when something has been broken open in them and they are deciding, for the first time, whether to look at what's inside. Bridget picked up the last cable, coiled it, put it in the case. She said, "I'm resigning. The letter is already in HR." She walked to the door. Hannel said, "I'd like to fix it." She stopped walking. "The Adami deal, the contract practices, all of it. I want to fix it, and I need someone who speaks everything I say, not just what I intend to say." Bridget stood with her hand on the door frame for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. She was not thinking about whether she believed him. She was thinking about what it meant to believe someone, the specific exposure of it, the specific courage of it. After 6 months of learning exactly what a person looks like when their words and their intentions have never once needed to match. She didn't say yes, she said, "I'll think about it." And she left. The Yon Global Lagos office was restructured. Hannel brought in an independent governance auditor, one he did not choose himself, one appointed jointly with the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission as part of an agreement that kept the company's license intact. 3 internal contracts were renegotiated. The Adami partnership was retabled under fully transparent terms and eventually signed. A genuine agreement this time, reviewed by both sides in both languages, with nothing soft about any clause on any page. Bridget did not go back to Yon Global. She opened a consulting firm, corporate interpretation and cross-cultural negotiation advisory, specializing in African and East Asian markets. Her first 3 clients were all companies that had previously worked with Yon Global and wanted someone in the room who would tell them what was actually being said. She was expensive, she was worth it. Hannel reached out twice, formally both times, through proper channels, with no pressure and no assumption of access. The first message was a referral to a client. The second was an invitation to consult on a Nairobi expansion project. She took the second one. Their first working meeting lasted 3 hours. It was entirely professional. At the end of it, Hannel said something in Korean, quietly, almost to himself, that Bridget understood completely and chose, for the first time, not to translate for the record. Some things you keep, not because they are secrets, but because they belong to the version of the story that hasn't been written yet. Bridget was 29 years old, fluent in 5 languages, and had just learned the most important thing that none of them could teach her, that the most powerful position in any room is not the one at the head of the table. It is the one that controls what the table understands. She had always been in that position. She had simply decided, 6 months into a job she was never meant to survive, to use it. If Bridget's patience gave you chills, if you felt every moment she held her face still while he exposed himself, then you already know this story hit different. Drop a comment. What was the moment you knew she had him? Was it when she kept the document? When she contacted Mrs. Adami? Or was it right there in that boardroom when she set her pen down? Subscribe, because there are more stories where this came from, women who were underestimated, rooms that got flipped, power that moved to exactly where it belonged. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember what quiet looks like right before it becomes loud.